All right. Welcome, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure we'll have some more people trickle in. So my name is Barika Williams. I'm the Executive Director at the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, or ANHD, as many of you might know us. And I just want to welcome everybody to this webinar hosted by the Fifth Avenue Committee on Housing in Sunset Park. And we're going to have a great conversation today. We've got some great panelists. I'm going to do a quick introduction of who our panelists are, give you a little bit about who ANHD is, and then we're going to turn it over and we'll do a quick presentation just overviewing some of the housing issues and opportunities in Sunset Park. So as I said, my name is Barika Williams. I'm the Executive Director at the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, and we are an umbrella organization that works across and with more than 80+ local neighborhood-based nonprofits, including CDCs like the Fifth Avenue Committee and tenants' rights groups like Neighbors Helping Neighbors. And we work with them across a number of different issues, including affordable housing, tenants' rights, equitable economic development, land use, responsible reinvestment in communities, really to advance neighborhood opportunity, racial and social justice in our communities, and focusing specifically on marginalized communities here in New York City. And we've been around for 45+ years and continue to move our work forward with our members, and always excited to have these conversations about what's happening on the ground. So I'm going to do a quick introduction for each one of our panelists, just something short and brief. So you have Matt Murphy, who's the Executive Director at the NYU Furman Center. Matt previously served as the Deputy Commissioner for the Office of Policy and Strategy for HPD, the Department of Housing and Preservation Development. And he's been he's been responsible for a number of and led a number of the housing policy and strategic planning and operations programs during his time there at HPD. Michelle De La Uz, who needs no introduction, most people should know her on here, is the Executive Director at the Fifth Avenue Committee, at FAC, as you'll hear us refer to it. And she has over 25 years of experience. FAC serves more than 5,500 low and moderate income people. They have a portfolio of more than 7 million housing assets. And Michelle, which I did not know, previously served as the first Director of Constituent Services for Congresswoman Nydia Velasquez. So new tidbit that I got to know. And then we have Aura Mejia, and she's a tenant and labor organizer at Fifth Avenue Committee since 2005. And I thought it was amazing that she has led and created a local initiative and campaign to engage leaders to both pass the rent laws that protect tenants, and also organizing around the asthma healthy homes law that ensures thinking about what a very timely topic of the intersections of health and homes, which all of those are thinking about very differently in this moment. So I wanted to introduce my panelists and say thank you, everybody, for coming together, and thank you, FAC, for pulling this together. And I will, I think if we are queued up technology-wise, I will turn it over to Michelle to run through the PowerPoint, if we can share the screen.
Yep, yeah. I will do that.
And while we're doing the tech of that, for all of our attendees, as we're going through, if you have questions that you want to ask, if you could use the Q&A button that should be at the bottom of your screen towards the right-hand side, we'll be monitoring and looking at that and pulling questions from there at the end as a part of the Q&A at the end of the session.
Great. Are you guys, are you seeing my screen? I think you are. So first off, thank you to Barika, who only the last few months became the new Executive Director of ANHD. And obviously, as a board member, I'm thrilled that she's in that role. And she comes with tremendous experience, both in affordable housing policy at ANHD and also with the governor's office here in New York. So we're very excited to have her in her role moderating and at ANHD. And thank you to all the panelists again, really, really appreciate, and thanks to the folks that have joined us. This is obviously a timely topic. Sunset Park has been in the news quite a lot lately. And I think for many of us who know or live or work in the community, we know that a lot of the issues that are outlined in this report, you know them firsthand, you know them from personal experience. But it's one thing, honestly, sometimes to kind of have the personal experience or the anecdotal experiences, and another thing to see the data. All the data that is in the report, which you can find on Fifth Avenue Committee's website, is publicly accessible data. I got a lot of it, honestly, from NYU Furman Center. So thank you to the Furman Center for the great job that they do in aggregating information and elevating a number of issues locally and nationally. A lot of it, some of it also came from ANHD, from the Department of City Planning, obviously from the Census, American Community Survey. And so, know that when the data talks about Sunset Park, it's primarily talking about Community Board 7, which I know is not just Sunset Park, but it is predominantly Sunset Park. So let's just go ahead and jump in. So Community Board 7, the rate of population growth for Community Board 7 from 2000 to 2018, which is where the latest information is that we have, is nearly 4 times what the rate has been for New York City and for Brooklyn. And that obviously has significant implications. And right now, population estimate, or I should say it's in 2018, the population estimate in Community Board 7 was 143,000, almost 144,000 people, if you use the data from the Department of City Planning. So that's, a number, the size of some, sizable cities across the country, and that's our neighborhood here. Oops, yeah, there we go, sorry. I think folks are familiar with the concept, I think, of rent burden. I think it's a couple different things to understand. Basically, if folks are paying no more than 30% of their income towards rent, then that housing is considered to be affordable to that family. And when people pay more than 30% of their income in rent, that's considered being rent burdened. In Sunset, you're severely rent burdened when you pay more than 50% of your income in rent. So as you can see, this is not a statistic that you want to do well in, unfortunately, or have a higher number. And in Sunset Park, a higher percentage of the population is severely rent burdened. And what's worse is that folks that are low income are nearly 50% of folks that are low income in the neighborhood are severely rent burdened. So I'm sure Ada will talk more about that when she speaks. The other piece is that median gross rent, which is really rent plus utilities, essentially is higher and has been trending higher in Community Board 7 than either in Brooklyn or in New York City as a whole. And Sunset Park has housing stock that's aging. Higher percentage of it is obviously over 60 years old, and some of that is wonderful and creates wonderful historic blocks, and other parts of that create some poor housing conditions. From ANHD's report not too long ago, about 19% of units in Sunset Park had severe housing code violations. And Sunset Park is now the fourth, or Community Board 7 is now the 4th most overcrowded community board in all of New York City. And this is something that I've shared previously, and it's kind of shocking to people, right? Because they see development going on, they see construction going on, and part of that, that the neighborhood has actually lost 3,775 units of housing between 2010 and 2018. In 2018, there were 45,903 units. In 2010, there were over 49,000 units in the neighborhood. And this is, that by the way, is net of any new units coming on during this time. This kind of talks a little bit about some of those new units that have come on. As you can see, there's been 51 market rate developments in the community, totaling just shy of 950 units. Sunset Park does not have any mandatory inclusionary housing units. The rezoning that happened in 2009 mapped voluntary inclusionary housing. And as you can see, there's been only a limited number of projects that have taken advantage of it. It is what it sounds like, voluntary, and not everybody takes advantage of it. But there are definitely solutions to these things. I feel like I skipped a slide. Yes, of course I did. Here we go. This is a very, very important slide. And this is, I'm sure Otto will get into this more. But all those conditions really contribute to some significant tenant harassment that has plagued residents in the community for some time. In 2016, when public advocate Tish James was in her role as public advocate, she named a landlord in Sunset Park where Neighbors Helping Neighbors and Fifth Avenue Committee have done organizing as part of the Stabilizing NYC coalition in a building that Silver Shore owned. And basically the concept of predatory investment is when a building is purchased for a price, at a price where the rents really can't support the price that it was purchased, and that really creates the conditions where harassment, flourish. And that's not something that's common in Sunset Park, unfortunately. And oftentimes people take advantage of the fact that it's a high immigrant population and people don't know their rights or don't speak the language. But there are some solutions. And we'll be able to talk more about this. Obviously, there's really significant existing rent stabilized housing stock in the neighborhood. Also, Section 8 housing. And the neighborhood does not have any public housing, so it's critically important that we do all we can to preserve the existing housing stock, which is majority of it is privately owned, right? Fifth Avenue Committee owns and manages more than 100 units of affordable housing in the neighborhood. We currently have in construction 134 units. By the way, the first new construction of family affordable housing in more than 15 years in the neighborhood. So it's important that we both preserve, but that we also create a pipeline of more 100% permanently affordable projects, and we can talk more about that. At the same time, though, we have this need, and there are some parcels of land, limited number of parcels of land that we should consider for rezoning. I want to make it clear, I'm not advocating, we're not talking about a neighborhood-wide rezoning. This is still predominantly a low and moderate income community of color. I have personally grave concerns about neighborhood-wide rezonings and low and moderate income communities of color, but limited actions that specifically can lead to new affordable housing opportunities or good jobs. That those are the things that are aligned with obviously the community's priorities. Those are the things that we should be talking about. And obviously we should be focused on enhancing and promoting tenant protection. So none of this is rocket science, right? But I think it's about elevating the fact that we need to do this. So on the preserving, this is one project that is currently for sale, right? I get every week get advertisements, setup sheets for multifamily properties, rent stabilized properties for sale. I know it's tough to talk about government financing, you know, at this moment in time, you know, given COVID and its impacts. But, you know, low interest rates, capital budgets, prices coming down, that's when honestly we should be thinking about acquiring assets that might be vulnerable and ensuring that we can keep them affordable in perpetuity. Advocacy is going on as well to through the Good Neighbor tax credit, now through the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, to support homeowners who provide units at affordable rents. This is important in Sunset Park, where about 28% of the units are home ownership units, and a number of those are 2 to 4 family. I'm going to better move this, right? I guess you guys see that. Obviously, you know, Sunset Park has a number of brownfield sites, has, you know, obviously a number of transit sites, you know, MTA sites, old rail yard sites that we should be thinking about whether or not we can repurpose portions of those sites to create new permanently affordable housing. Our Sunset Park project here, which I'm sure you're all watching go up, we're at about 40% construction completion. We're going to start marketing in the winter of 2021. We're very excited that the project's moving along, and so it's great that we're able to do that. I wanted to talk about, as part of the rezoning for opportunity, you know, obviously when the Sunset Park neighborhood was rezoned in 2009, although Fifth Avenue Committee and Neighbors Helping Neighbors and a whole coalition of folks advocated vigorously for the Bloomberg administration to map mandatory inclusionary housing in Sunset Park, you know, the Bloomberg administration didn't want to do that. The furthest they wanted to go was voluntary inclusionary housing. We see the impact of that, you know, 5 projects, handful of affordable housing units. You know, if there are limited sites, targeted sites that make sense for rezoning now for residential units, you're going to trigger mandatory inclusionary housing, right? It's a real opportunity to help address some of the community's needs, and quite honestly, do it faster than the 100% affordable housing projects can do. You know, obviously Fifth Avenue Committee believes deeply in 100% affordable housing projects. That is what we focus on. But it can take years to assemble all of the subsidy necessary to actually bring those units online. And so it's critical that we think about MIH as a way to help address needs. And obviously, in particular, we want to see MIH used you know, on a broader scale in a number of communities, you know, not just Sunset Park. And you can see, you know, in the New York City's MIH program, although advocates, you know, we have thoughts about continuing to improve upon what is here. You know, it's a good start with all of the units created through MIH are permanently affordable, and they're at income levels that are reasonable, although, again, we'd love them to be even more deeply affordable. And then on the you know, tenant protection side of things, there are a number of things. Obviously, when the tenant right to counsel legislation passed, our friends CASA in the Bronx did an amazing job to organize around that during the Jerome Avenue rezoning. And now, you know, tenants, low and moderate income tenants citywide, and have access to legal counsel to help represent them, make it a fair fight in housing court. Right, that resource isn't yet fully rolled out to the zip codes in Sunset Park, and so that's something that we'd like to see for sure. Certificate of No Harassment program is what it sounds like. Basically, if harassment has been found on an individual level or in communities where it's been rolled out at the community board level, then you know, the cure is quite significant. Basically, folks have to the landlord or the developer has to set aside housing in on a permanent basis that are affordable. And then, of course, not certainly incredibly important. Again, I'm sure Auda will talk more about this, but you know, when the tenant advocates upstate and downstate won the strengthening of rent stabilization more than a year ago, the thing that got left on the table was passing good cause eviction, and that's something that advocates would like to see. You can see the report if you haven't already. There's more detail in it on FACT's website. Feel free to download it. And for folks who want to get involved in local campaigns to strengthen tenants' rights or to help advocate for more affordable housing, you can reach Auda at this email. So I will stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Barika.
Great, thank you for that, Michelle. Great presentation and data and information, and really just captures and makes clear the housing crisis that Sunset Park is facing and has been in, and thinking about some of the options and solutions for addressing the affordable housing shortage that those communities currently facing. Just one note that I think is a clarifying question is I think somebody specifically asked if the data, any of the data presented in there includes numbers from up into and through COVID. And I believe, I'm pretty sure I'm right, Michelle, that it doesn't, just because there's generally and always a lag in data. So just keeping that in mind. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt Murphy to talk about and discuss some housing updates in the time of the pandemic, and then also looking at and thinking about NYU's previous 2016 study that showed how and that Sunset Park was gentrifying and the need and range of interventions. So Matt, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Barika, and thank you everybody for having me. I'm really happy to be here. So I want to talk a little bit maybe about the gentrification study first. I think it makes it so apparent how unique in a lot of ways Sunset Park is and has been. And then I'll talk a little bit about COVID as well and some of the concerns there. So in 2016, we did a study of gentrification in New York City. And, you know, when you sit down to do something like this, you kind of go into it knowing that everyone kind of has their own definition of gentrification. And it's very hard to pin down. And that includes places like NYU and other kind of research-oriented universities, and, you know, someone that you would talk to on your block. And that's a good thing. And that's a healthy debate that people have. So we tried to kind of use our access to data and information in New York City's history to offer a sense of gentrification and contextualize some of the issues around it when we look at New York City neighborhoods that have been experiencing it. And so what we tried to say, or what we sat down and did and said, okay, we want to go back not just a couple years ago, but actually back to 1990. Some studies go back to 1960. That's kind of when the first term, or, you know, people started saying that term. But we went back to 1990 and said, okay, of all the community districts, as Michelle mentioned, we use community districts for data reasons, in the city, which ones had lower incomes to begin with? Which of the residents that live there, lower than median, or actually in our case, 40th percentile incomes? And then we looked at, from 1990, all of those areas that experienced that, compared it to all other areas in the city, all other community districts, and said, how much did rent go up in each of those districts? And to get a sense of, okay, gentrification is really, you know, kind of a convergence of this low-income populations experiencing extraordinary rent increases. That's as a public policy concern, because it leads to displacement. And so what we found was that when you look at all of the community districts that we did, that of the 22 community districts that started off low income to begin with, 15 experienced such large increases in rent that we classified them as gentrifying. And this actually included Sunset Park. And when you look at a map of this, you know, a lot of neighborhoods in central Brooklyn, northern Manhattan, South Bronx, when you have national conversations of gentrification and Lower East Side, you know, these are the kind of neighborhoods that I think people have in their mind, or New Yorkers have in their mind. Williamsburg, but I think, you know, Sunset Park doesn't get, you know, openly kind of discussed in the same way as some of these other neighborhoods, and I think, you know, it needs to be, because it is an affordable housing issue. When we look at, you know, some of the kind of commonalities of gentrifying areas, we found that gentrifying neighborhoods, when we look at them all together, they had more housing units built between 2000 and 2010, so their housing stock grew faster. Recently available rental units became less affordable to low-income households in all neighborhoods in New York City, but really acutely in gentrifying neighborhoods, of which Sunset Park would be one. So once a unit turns over, it's just less affordable over time to the local residents. This was interesting that Sunset Park was, while only gentrifying neighborhoods saw an average household income increase between 1990 and 2014 relative to other areas, Sunset Park's residents' average household income actually decreased. So you have this rent going up kind of at the same time that incomes are arguably stagnant or going down. And that's, you know, these are issues. And so, you know, when you think about some of the solutions we're going to talk about, and some of the other kind of issues that broad context creates, we also now layer in COVID, right? And now this public health crisis, economic crisis. These have huge implications, not only for New York City and all of the questions around city government, but also around the residents, especially of an area like Sunset Park. So we've done a lot of analysis on the potential for the scale of non-payment of rent and evictions, largely because of the huge underlying labor issues, right? So many people losing work, not being able to go into work, seasonal jobs kind of being lost. And, you know, it just creates a huge amount of pressure on a neighborhood that's already facing these pressures. And so, you know, one thing that really stood out to us is that we found that when we looked at all of the types of jobs that were being lost across the state of New York, we look at the industries people work in, a huge number of industries that people work in where they lost their jobs are really disproportionately kind of, the jobs are filled by Hispanic workers. I use that term because the census uses it, but half of, or 48% of these, of Hispanic workers in New York worked in jobs that are vulnerable because of COVID job loss. So, you know, this is a huge issue. It's not just an issue for this COVID time period. It's obviously the convergence of this. We have to be concerned now about the intersection of all these things and kind of what the consequences are for affordable housing.
Great. Thank you, Matt. It's a lot of what Matt was talking about, and some of the data and thinking about the industries is really echoed with some of the other data analysis, including some analysis that ANHD has done around where we see our essential workers overlapping with rent burden, overlapping predominantly with our BIPOC neighborhoods. So very similar sort of data points and conclusions that we're seeing across different research orgs. Okay, just a reminder to everybody, as you're going through, we're going to have time for questions and answers at the end. So as you're going through, if you have questions, please use the Q&A bottom at the bottom of your screen. It's right there, two to the right of the green share screen button. there's different stuff going back and forth in chat, so that way we can make sure we can see them all. We're going to use that Q&A button so that we can hopefully get to and catch as much as possible. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to Aura, who's going to discuss her experience and her expertise as a tenant organizer and advocate coordinator with Neighbors Helping Neighbors, and talking about some of the displacement threats, which obviously ties into the conversation around gentrification in a gentrifying neighborhood that Matt was just speaking about, and what are the experiences on the ground? What does it look like day to day for tenants and neighbors in the community? So Aura, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. And I just want to, before anything, I want to invite everybody to fill out their census. Part of the problem that we have in the communities are that we are not getting everybody to fill out their census, and we're not getting the fundings that we need in the communities. Also, I want to thank everybody in the organizing unit that are working in the frontline, FAC, and NHN, the advocates and the organizers, because they're doing a great job in the community to make sure that families stay at their homes and stop a lot of the evictions. One of the things that I could tell you that I've been seeing since 2013 that I started working at NHN is that we started losing a lot of affordable housing, but unregulated, meaning that people that were living in private houses, though it came a big wave of tenants that came to Neighbors Helping Neighbors asking for help. Unfortunately, because they were unregulated, that it was not that much defense for the evictions. But right after that, we start seeing rent stabilized tenants being harassed by landlords, and seeing that the landlords were not small landlords. They were more like predatory companies that were coming to the neighborhood. And one of the things that we saw a lot was that they were doing mass evictions in buildings, applying MCI, major capital improvement increases, and also trying to use every type of harassment tactics to push tenants out. Not only about the repairs, but also about harassing them about their status and their where they come from and about their language. One of the things that we see a lot is that where there's a big connection of a higher violations, housing violation, there's a lot of evictions. And this is the reason that we had to organize. And part of it is understanding that housing is a human right, but also right now it's a health crisis. And we've seen this for years. If we see Sunset Park has one of the highest numbers on health issues, especially on asthma. And all of these are triggers to housing issues that, landlords could fix. The mold, water leaks, roaches, mice. And this is the reason that I say it's not only about housing and harassment, but it's also about health issues. And now during the pandemic, we've seen the numbers of people suffering. Part of it is because they don't have insurance, and part of it is because it's overcrowding the apartments where they're living in. We have numbers of families that have been fighting harassment in the community. And this, I'm going to give you an example of one family that everybody in the family got engaged to the point that they're participating in hearings, they're mobilizing, and they're fighting back. So if a good thing comes out of something like this is that the people are fighting back. So what we're trying to do at Neighbors Helping Neighbors is to educate the community and make sure that we engage them and give them the power to fight back. So this is some of the things. We have a lot of tenant associations that a lot of the tenants are, tenant leaders are right here right now. Thank you for coming, and thank you for the BTU members that are engaged and that are connected to. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ada. And key points of housing is a human right, but housing is also healthcare, right? Which I think is that you said that is Something that many people knew and talked about and realized and lived every day, but I think in the midst of what we're seeing in COVID, it's really become front and center. And I like to talk about, our community orgs are our caretakers. Those are neighbors helping neighbors back. Those are our community caretakers and are the ones that we turn to in these moments in time. All right, so we're going to turn it over and we're going to try to address some of the questions that have come up. We'll try to get through as many of the Q&A pieces and items that we can in the time. But I think sort of some key things that have come up across everybody's different points is really focusing on the housing crisis in Sunset Park, what that looks like in terms of to have this community where we're seeing increase in population, really a drop off in affordable housing units, stagnant, if not declining incomes, compounding to an affordable housing shortage, and then exacerbated pressures on tenants that are where we're seeing increase in tenants evictions, increases in tenant harassment, all combining to this one neighborhood and what that means for going forward. So first question actually comes into Michelle. Let me get my text straight and cue it up. Michelle, a specific question is from Jorge, and to try to understand how a new MIH project compares to a FAC project. And I think this really exemplifies, like, what does it mean to do mission-driven development and mission-driven affordable housing development versus an MIH or partly affordable project?
I mean, obviously, I'm very biased for 100% affordable housing projects. I think they do the most good. So MIH projects, they're either 75% market rate, 25%, permanently affordable, or 30% permanently affordable and 70% market rate. So the difference with MIH is that, under the best of circumstances, government is not there's no tax dollars going into that project. It's the market rate units that are cross-subsidizing and making those units affordable in perpetuity. Obviously 100% affordable housing project, there's, obviously there's more benefit. Our projects, Fifth Avenue Committee really prides ourselves, we pride ourselves on building projects that really match community need. Our AMI, or the income levels that we're targeting for both the Sunset Park Library Affordable Housing Project and our 6309 4th Avenue project, they match the need that exists in Sunset Park. Many, families at many different income bands will be able to apply and, and finally get affordable housing in those projects, or seniors in the case of the 6309 4th Avenue project. But that does take a long time. Like, in both cases, we applied for competitive financing, low-income housing tax credits. And it can take multiple rounds, which means multiple years of applying. Even if your project scores well, and ours did, we scored well enough to receive credits. But because there's such a need and it's so competitive, you basically have to wait your turn for your project. And so a community, you could be waiting years just to assemble the financing so that you can begin construction of a project. But meanwhile, the need continues to grow. So that's why it's important to, again, in limited circumstances, especially in a neighborhood like Sunset Park, where there's such displacement risk, in limited circumstances, we should consider rezoning for projects that bring that 25% permanently affordable housing that's deeply affordable. That's something we should consider.
And I guess sort of building from that, Michelle, but open to Matt and Aura as well, is sort of the bigger, maybe that's what does this look like on the ground, project by project, how long does it take? But I think there's a bigger question that some folks might have around, why is now the right time to start increasing the amount of affordable housing in Sunset Park? Why is now the time to focus on preserving existing affordable housing in Sunset Park, right? There are some who might try to say, well, it's either it's too late or we don't need to do it yet, or now is not the time. So why is now the time?
Is that a question for any of us, or?
Any of you?
I mean, how do you want to go first on the need for preservation or anything? I mean, why now, Auda?
I think because a lot of the tenants are very low income. It's a low income community. Brown and Black communities are the ones that's being targeted by predatory landlords coming over, taking over, and pushing the tenants out, and putting those units for higher rents. So we need affordable housing, not only preserving, but building up, because we have the homeless population in New York City is the highest. So we need to make sure that our community have that affordability in housing, to make sure that we don't have that much of overcrowded apartments too. So it's important to not only to build affordable housing, but to preserve, to continue fighting, to engage the community, to make sure that they know exactly what they need and how they could get involved and fight for it.
The other thing I would add is, you know, I know the Great Recession, you know, more than 10 years ago seems like a distant memory considering everything that we've all lived through in the last few months. But you know, the experience of those of us that, you know, are in the tenant advocacy and organizing world, and if you look at the data, is, you know, corporate landlords swooped in during the Great Recession and bought single family, 1 to 4 family, multifamily properties. And then, you know, and you know, again, even properties that was owner occupied homeowner housing, right? And then during the foreclosure crisis, and then turned those into rental properties. Right, they're the ones with capital. They're the ones that swooped in, and that contributed to displacement of long-term residents in those neighborhoods. So, you know, during economic downturns, you know, those with resources take advantage, and at the expense of longtime community members. And so I'm deeply concerned about that. And I'm, you know, again, I see these setup sheets, right, from the brokers that, you know, come into my email box like weekly, and I'm just like, I shudder when I see it, because to me, that's like the first sign of displacement to come.
So we've got a, Matt, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself. Classic Zoom issue. So yeah, I would just add, you know, you know, or double down kind of on what Michelle was saying about the counter-cyclical element. Like, you know, there's an uncertain future right now in New York City, but I think, you know, people are confident that, you know, the city will be fine in the long term. You know, we're gonna see. But, you know, urban planners, city government leaders, civic leaders, community leaders, you know, have in the past kind of used moments like these to find new opportunities, redefine the way things have been done, you know, find kind of willing partners, new partners to take on ambitious projects. You know, that's part of the ingenuity of New York City. It's what makes it so great. And that happens at every level of government, and, you know, from community boards to, you know, big kind of nonprofit landlords, corporate landlords, whomever. Like, there are banks, you know, there are willing partners. But, you know, there does need to be a vision for shaping the future, and people need to be confident in what's going, or people need to be confident enough to invest. And I think that confidence will be there. I would just, you know, just looking at some of this, again, Sunset Park data, you know, Sunset Park, of all the community districts in the city, has the 4th highest rate of overcrowding, severe overcrowding. People are doubling up, tripling up. I'm sure Ara has seen countless kinds of scenarios in which people are, you know, they're doing what they can to get by and living with family and friends or whoever. They're tapping credit that you would never see on a credit report. You know, it's with family and friends. And when we looked at, you know, again with COVID, like the density question of will, does COVID spread more in more dense areas of the city? We found that in the most dense areas of the city, density being people per acre, it actually is the lowest rate. Those are parts of Manhattan. It was much higher in areas where you had the higher overcrowding rates. Corona, Sunset Park, kind of immigrant New York, to be frank. And, this is the health intersection. Affordable housing, we can talk about the income limits, we will, because I see Q&A about it. Done right, those are new opportunities for those families. Like that, that's kind of the point. And the reason that it talks about, or a lot of the conversation is about health now, is because healthcare professionals are literally looking at it. Health foundations are funding work to research the health benefits of affordable housing and finding that it helps reduce asthma. It helps de-stress people, which has huge health implications, especially for low-income families. So, the question of why now is kind of this COVID moment and also the city's moment, but it's also kind of, it should always be the infrastructure of a successful neighborhood is this, anchoring it with affordable housing. So, I think it's just and Sunset Park is kind of the case study of New York City neighborhoods where this conversation needs to happen.
Sounds great. And very much echo and want to lift up what Matt was saying about overcrowding. I saw Auda nodding and agreeing of what she sees on the ground. And I know Furman Center, ANHD, CHBC, a number of different housing organizations in New York City, but also some of our partners and friends in other countries. I was in a conversation with the Oregon in Sao Paulo in Brazil, have been saying the same thing. It's about communities that are overcrowded, that are disenfranchised, that are marginalized, that figure out how to do it, as opposed to high density neighborhoods, which is where we see high wealth and access to healthcare. And that's really the difference and disparity there. We've got a couple of questions, but I think this is important thinking about, we're going to head towards like, what does the future look like? But we've got a couple of questions on sort of how did we get to here? So specifically from Toby, but I think a couple of other people as well want to understand where the loss of units, where that 3,000 drop in units came from, and how did that, like, what is that rooted in? How did that come about?
I actually want to say, I think Auda put her finger on it earlier when she said she saw tenants coming from privately owned homes that weren't rent stabilized, so under 6 units, where basically the turnover and ownership might have happened, and that longtime tenant, who was there when Juana owned the building, enjoyed a low rent, but then when the building got sold, and their mortgage was higher, they realized they can't, they needed to collect a higher rent, and that went from, so that property that maybe was a 1 to 4 became a 1 or a 2, right? As people combine units and things like that. So I think that represents a significant portion of it. And in the report, if you go in there, I didn't talk about it so much in the PowerPoint, but in the report, there's a whole, some charts about like how much the prices of homes, 1 to 4 family homes have increased in Sunset Park, and that's been exponential as well in the last few years. And that I think is driving some of that loss of the non-rent regulated housing stock. I don't know if others have insight.
Anybody else? Okay. So let me go to the next question, which came in, which was around, has development on top of existing municipal or federally owned properties been considered? This is a question of like, so folks think about building on top of post offices or fire stations. I know there's been 1 or 2 projects that have tried to, maybe are off the ground on libraries, but that's not federal. So I'll turn that over to both Michelle and Matt, probably, who both have experience on it.
Yeah, so we mean fact advance the model. We have the first, project in the city, affordable housing, 100% affordable housing over a library. When we're done, the Sunset Park Library, we're nearly, double in size, and we'll have 50 units of permanently affordable housing on top. So yes, we've absolutely considered it. We've, FAC has looked at other sites. Obviously, there's a one-story police station along 4th Avenue, post office sites. And, when we looked at this, when FAC looked at this issue more than 10 years ago, we basically, we're basically, the population in the city of New York is projected to increase, right? We're not creating more land, right? And so you have to think about what sites are being underutilized that maybe are more aligned with the public good, right? And so government-owned sites are absolutely things that we've looked at. It took us a while, each time you have these ideas, it takes a while to create a new model. Already the library model is being replicated up in Inwood. But it does take a minute to figure these things out and make sure that, that other public use has to, either temporarily or permanently move someplace else. And, obviously in the case of the library, it was critically important that that library come back and be an incredibly new feature and benefit to the neighborhood. It's the 6th busiest library in all of Brooklyn, for instance. So, so that you have to work through that with each government-owned site, whether it's a post office or any other potential site that might be underutilized. So that's important.
Yeah, and I would just add, this is kind of the question of, rezoning, right? Or why people bring up rezonings. It's because sites like these are tapped out. It takes a really long time to do this, and longer in government, frankly. I can say that because I used to work in government. But even if I didn't, I would say it. There's a lot of relocation. There's not a centralized kind of agency that handles the kind of long-term development strategy for city assets. There is, and I think people are very good at it. It's hard work, and things change, and administrations change. And then, you work a really long time for the addition of 20 or 30 units. It's all to say New York City, the reason we're having these discussions is because we're getting close to being a built out city. The city's zoned for maybe like 12 million people. And a lot of neighborhoods have really low vacancy rates, really low, the population just soaks up into the housing units. And so this is why people put rezoning on the table. It's both, because of the growth we've experienced and the intersection of that with the existing building stock and housing stock, of which from Michelle's presentation, you can see is generally like old, relatively old. And, so this is why you talk about those things. Uses change, the economy has changed. And so, these are the underlying reasons, but finding the nooks and crannies of kind of development opportunities in New York City, I think is excellent urban planning. And, looking at our municipal assets, I think is key, and understanding how we can do better with those. And so, but, it's all part of like, thinking of all the ways you can add housing units. All of that I think should be on the table.
Thank you. So actually, Matt, you're sort of taking us into some of the next, we've got a couple of questions that are tied to rezonings and to density. So I'll maybe start with Aura on this question. And Aura, I know you do some work on rezonings, if I'm remembering correctly. That is not maybe your core, but I know you're tapped into sort of what happens on the ground and what tenants are seeing or feeling. So how do you see the current administration's approach and sort of take of rezoning? And many people feel like they leave low-income people out of housing opportunities. What would you want to say to a potential new Democratic mayoral candidate about rezonings, about density, and what you hear day to day when you're talking to tenants and residents?
So I'm just going to give you an example. When I was working at Fifth Avenue Committee on the 4th Avenue rezoning. It just came to us like really like a bucket of water. We know that it was coming on, and a lot of people were being pushed out of the rent-stabilized buildings in the area. So one of the things that I will say right now and for the future is that it's important that we have protections on the table, and to make sure that the community see that every time there is a rezoning, to make sure that we protect the affordable housing units that we have, existing units, and to make sure that we are part of any affordable housing that is being built in the communities. That's very important because right now we're seeing that the rezoning that is being placed is in the low-income communities. So we need something on the table to make sure that we protect the tenants from the areas, from the communities.
Right. Yep. And Michelle and Matt, similar question. So, you know, how do we think about what would you want to say to an incoming mayoral candidate about rezonings? And I'm going to tack on another part of somebody's question here around, you know, how do we think about if a neighborhood-wide rezoning is off the table and there's not very much public land in Sunset Park, how do we create more affordable housing? What's the elements to put together to get us there?
Well, in Sunset Park, I think, and this is you know, talked about in the report. You know, there are underutilized sites in Sunset Park, again, next to transit. You know, I think about the MTA site where the train terminus comes, and you know, those trains don't take up all the area that the MTA owns and controls, and a lot of it is you know, immediately adjacent to existing blocks that you know, have buildings, and quite honestly, redevelopment along the edges could actually help knit the community back together a bit in areas where it kind of feels abruptly stopped because of the train cut. So that to me, those areas kind of have the greatest potential without any risk of displacement. And so I think, you know, things like that should be on the table. You know, in general, the next mayor, you know, Bloomberg's big bargain, right, when he did his rezonings was, okay, you know, mostly white homeowners, I'm going to down zone and protect your area, but I'm going to up zone the transit areas. And the transit areas, you know, transit-oriented development areas were predominantly the areas, as Auda said, on 4th Avenue in 2003 in North Park Slope. That's where the rent-stabilized housing in Gowanus and Park Slope was located. And we said, no, 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 don't do it. It's going to, you know, lead to the loss of rent-stabilized housing. And, you know, every environmental analysis said no, because, you know, it considered rent-stabilized housing like not at risk when we were like, you know, it's at risk. There's lots of loopholes, and it's getting demolished. And so it's just super critical that, you know, that we look at SECRA and we update the environmental analysis so that it's accurate, and that if we're going to look at rezonings, that quite honestly, the upper income communities, the whiter communities, they need to be on the table. Like it can't all be in communities of color. The growth that's needed in New York City can't be borne by the communities that have the greatest risk of displacement. That is not equitable.
Yeah, and I would just add, the next mayor is going to face a really different fiscal environment than what the beginning of at least the de Blasio administration faced. I mean, the reality is the budget is just getting cut. We don't know the long-term consequences, and affordable housing, it does cost money. It costs local resources. We give loans that cost less than the cost of that money. We do property exemptions. We got all sorts of stuff to make this stuff happen. And there's a, but we're kind of in that counter cycle right now, and that includes government. And so the MIH question, or the kind of rezoning question, will become, I think, one of the affordable housing tools that will, have to be put on the table, because it doesn't cost like the government, a dollar. It doesn't cost money. It's the value of the change in the land use that kind of gets you the affordable housing, and then the property tax exemption, which does kind of cost money. But I just bring that up to say, the next mayor is just going to be facing that. They're going to have this tool kind of available, and it'll be a question of how it gets used. And so, some of these questions are about, upzoning wealthier neighborhoods, and Michelle brought it up too. I think that does need to be on the table. Affordable housing as an integration tool, both economic and racial integration, frankly. The most number of low-income jobs in the city are in Midtown. In Soho, you have huge amounts of retail. The people that are making and serving lunch there, they're not living in Soho. Yeah, so creating affordable housing opportunities in places like that, I think, is going to have to be, put on the table as a potential fight for the next mayor. And then I also just, what I would, personally want to see is a strategy, like neighborhoods that are kind of selected for rezoning, the reasoning behind that, and how, how we create anti-displacement tools, how we think about the long-term goal of economic integration of those neighborhoods.
And fair housing.
Yeah, exactly. So, these are the types of things that, I think will come up for the next mayor. And I hope the next mayor doesn't avoid it. I hope the next mayor doesn't just say, like, I'm not doing that, because I do think there's a lot of land use that needs to be looked at in New York City. I do think that we have this kind of pretty strong integration tool, affordable housing tool. And so I hope that it is a discussion.
And I think I think some of what Ara said something, or it's like, right, I think there's this question of how does I sort of chuckled when Michelle said bargain, when this grand bargain, how can we think of a grand bargain that isn't done on the backs of our immigrant, Black, brown, low-income communities, as Ara said, where it doesn't happen, where all of a sudden you're thrown this bucket of water in your face that's already done, right? Okay, so we've got a couple questions, and we're going to start to wind down. We've got a couple questions on MIH that I want to try to get to, and one on basement apartments. So one, there's sort of two questions of is there an example of a rezoning where there has been a net gain of affordable housing, and how do we assure that in rezoning we get to deep affordability and like real community-based deep affordability, not just by the AMI, by the income bands affordability, where you can have units that are still $1,200, $1,800 that count as quote unquote affordable to the community.
So I think the question on the net gain on the affordable housing, I think the person's probably referring to city, like a neighborhood-wide example. I mean, obviously Hudson Yards, right? But I mean, there was nothing there before. So I don't know, Matt, can you come up with any?
Yeah,
I think Gowanus will be that when it's, but not, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's that, theoretically, it depends on how, I think this is a great question. It depends on how you define the term affordable housing, because obviously the concern a lot of people have is that a rezoning creates so much value that, people are pushed out. We've done some research on this around kind of the question of displacement of low-income families on Medicaid, looking at their rates of movement both in and out of gentrifying neighborhoods, meaning the non-gentrifying neighborhoods and gentrifying neighborhoods. And we didn't find elevated rates when you compare those types of areas. But what we do see is that there is just a lot of housing instability for people. There's just a lot of movement often and which has long-term consequences. And so, so I think the question of MIH and the question of is there a net gain on affordable housing units, it's like theoretically the way we define affordable housing and in any new affordable or MIH kind of rezoned area, you're always going to have a net gain of affordable housing units because that's now that's the new baseline. You have to do at least 20 or 25%. The question of, over time, what are the consequences? I think it's still really young. And so the whole idea of this is that you're going to have more, the mixed income kind of neighborhoods that we want to see are going to grow over time. So a lot of seeds have been planted. It will be a question of how they grow. So it's not going to be even the next mayor that might see, the East New York affordable housing units or the one after that. It's going to be questions of 50, 60 years from now. Are we glad that the planners from 2015 did this? And I think that's when you kind of have to answer it. That being said, I think you are going to see net gains. It's just going to be this question of, the affordability levels, which I think is a genuine issue. And I think there does need to be a good hard look at in each development at income levels, ensuring you have income mixes, but you're also you're not kind of going by like, we have to hit 80% AMI every time, or we have to do this, that you are really intentionally seeking out these income mixes and that also serve people that have lived in the community.
Right. And I think a way for folks to think about this and flesh this out is in any one of these neighborhoods, as Matt was saying, you've got what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, which is just like the landlord doesn't interact with any subsidy or any program. It's just inexpensive rent. You've got rent stabilized, which our is lifting up, which is not the same as subsidized, which is not the same as NYCHA, which is not the same as market rate. And all these things are going to mix together in a neighborhood where you've seen MIH. And I think time will tell whether that shakes out. But I do think it's very telling that right up front, has there been a net gain? Everybody has to pause and say, well, has there? Do we know if there has been? Can we point to an example? So add a little bit on how do we assure these units stay deeply affordable, not just rooted in AMI and not just rooted in sort of the median income restrictions. And I know up front, you and Michelle talked a little bit about just cause eviction and some of the tenants' rights. So can you speak a little bit about how we should be thinking about protecting the affordability of units?
Oh, it's well, making sure that the tenants are included in the movement and asking the tenants exactly what they want for their communities and making sure that we pass rent laws that protect the tenants. In this case, I think if we have a law that will protect all tenants in general, not only rent stabilized tenants, it will help to make sure that people stay in their apartments. Like I say, with the unregulated tenants that came to our office, they told us stories that they were living in the apartment for 15 years, 10 years, and they were only paying like $800. Sometimes they have access to the garage, and they were like a family. But I guess because people were trying to sell the properties, they were trying to push tenants out. So having those protections to make sure that people stay in their communities. Some of the tenants were seniors, and they were like telling us that they wanted to stay in the community because their churches were nearby, their medical offices were nearby. They want to stay by their family, but it was going to be critical and very stressful for them to move to another area that they don't know by heart. Like one of the tenants one time mentioned, my parents could go shopping in the area with their eyes closed because they know their neighborhood is so good that they know where to go, where to get their stuff. So I think thinking about that we need to make sure that everybody has access to affordable housing, and the government really see it as a need in the community. And one of the things that I wanted to say is that I'm glad that you brought the health issue, but the mental health issue, because I've seen a lot of children suffering from trauma because being harassed or pushed out of their apartments and not being able to perform in schools. So everything is connected, the education, the health, and the housing. So we have to make sure that we push our local politicians to pass these laws that's going to protect the tenants, because a long way, the government is going to save a lot of money.
Yeah, and I think that it's such a great point. And in the midst of COVID, people are talking about the physical health, right? The asthma, diabetes, how that's connected to housing, but there's a huge mental health component to this. And the mental health impacts for seniors, for children, for all of us and anybody who has the amount of housing instability or harassment or displacement in terms of what they go through. And then to Matt's point, when we see that happening very frequently in neighborhoods, high rates of mobility and happening to a family or multiple families over and over again. We're going to do one last question and then close out. And so this one was specifically around just wanting to get some feedback from one or any of the panelists who want to take this up around the New York City pilot program to legalize basement apartments, commonly referred to as the BASE campaign. In other cities, this is called ADUs, folks, accessory dwelling units. So you'll sort of hear them called both things. But some thoughts, I know actually Aura just mentioned having access to garages. So how should we be thinking about these accessory basement spaces?
We should be figuring out how to legalize them, honestly. I mean, they're being used, right? They're being used and they're being used illegally and unsafely right now. I mean, I won't forget when you know, Fifth Avenue Committee built, you know, our first project or most recent new construction project that we completed in Community Board 7 is right on the border on 16th Street and Fifth Avenue. Supportive housing, single adults, 60% of folks, you know, homeless from shelters, and then 40% from Community Board 7. And, you know, and we prioritize, you know, seniors and things like that. And I'll never forget one of the women who, you know, won one of the slots through a lottery. You know, she talked about how she had been basically in living in an unheated basement. This is a woman in her, you know, mid-60s in Sunset Park for years, right? And she was just like so thankful to have her own place and for it to be, you know, decent and affordable. That like people are living that way, right? People are living that way, and government, we need to be thinking about how to, you know, do it safely. And you know, this is a big campaign that Chaya started in Queens, obviously. You know, a big part of what Cypress Hills Local Development Corporation fought for as part of the East New York rezoning. And, you know, it's one of the first programs to get cut as a result of COVID, right? It's a problem. Because we're just going to see more people in illegal basement conversion type situations if that are unsafe. If we don't find a way to like make it work, it's happening because the rents are high, right? And because there's a real need. Like you don't see everything we just saw about overcrowding and rents and all of that, and not like people find a way.
And I think creating a program for abatement to provide it to the landlords to keep it up to code and to make sure that the tenants stay in the apartment, something like Section 8 kind of voucher for unregulated tenants. That will be something that it will help not only the tenants, but the small landlords to be able to keep it up to code.
Great. Yeah, and this is I feel like this one that we're closing on the BASE campaigns is a great example of how communities across New York City, and especially Black and Brown communities and immigrant communities, come together because they have shared experiences. Michelle mentioned Chaya, Cypress Hills, BAC. These are all ANHD members that work in different neighborhoods across the city, but really struggle with some similar challenges and want to build solutions that serve their community, and really is about a citywide issue, but is rooted in very specific Brown and Black communities. So I just want to thank everybody for joining. I know we didn't get to all the questions. I always feel like we could do this for hours. I think there was a question, so I'll direct that person at the end of Michelle's PowerPoint. I think there was an email for FAC around getting involved. I know there's some interest in potentially having the presentation go to CB7 or some other groups because it's just such great data and information about Sunset Park. So we'll go ahead and perfect.
Here it is.
So putting that email, she's ahead of me. Putting that email up, so reach out to Fifth Avenue Committee. But thank you to Michelle, to FAC, to Bora, to Auda,
Thank
and
you.
to Matt at the Furman Center for joining us. And we hope that this is a great and informative conversation for everybody. But let's forge ahead and push ahead on getting more affordable housing and better affordability and deeper affordability for Sunset Park and Sunset Park tenants and residents.
Thank you, everybody. And thanks to those who joined.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Very good.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Yes.